Oil prices in Asia trading upwards after a fairly significant decline yesterday. As I said, this is the third week in which there does seem to be a downward draft in the oil price. Yesterday being sizable, but closed below $100 on Brent. First time in I think a month that's happened. But clearly this remains a volatile market. Let's kick off with Vandana Hari, founder and CEO of Vanda Insights, sitting in Singapore, and certainly enjoyed reading your Vanda Insights this week regarding this, what you call a demand wobble. Tell us a little bit about your views on a demand wobble, Vandana.
Good morning, afternoon from Singapore. So the wobble was referring to the world's two largest oil consumers, the US and China. I'm sure Albert will have much more to talk about with regard to the lockdown in Shanghai and what's happening and what that's doing to Chinese demand. But I was also paying close attention to the US data, and just to take a 4-week average basis to remove sort of weekly up and down movements that are quite often noise. And overall, US oil demand on a 4-week average basis has now slumped to a little under 100% of 2019 levels, having been close to 104, 105% for the past several months. So 4 to 5% above 2019 levels, it slipped down. So gasoline demand has been gradually edging lower since March. I think even more stark downturn has been observed in diesel demand in the US, which had picked up quite phenomenally over the past several months, perhaps even more so than gasoline, and has shown a very sharp downturn, which ties in with observations in the US trucking market. Just people are consuming less of goods movement happening. And the slowdown in trucking market tallies very well with the drop in diesel demand. So if you have the world's two largest oil consumers either showing a plateauing or even a softening of demand, then you're left, of course, looking at India, the third largest consumer. But again, China and India often talked about in the same breath, but a huge gap. If you look at the ballpark figure, let's say China consuming 15 million barrels a day and India consuming just about 5 million barrels a day. So any amount of strong demand growth in India is not going to overcome the drop in Chinese demand, which we have seen. So the latest estimates by the CNPC research team were almost 3%, 450,000 barrel per day year-on-year drop in Q1 in China. And I suspect that's going to be the norm for the rest of this year as well.
Well, we have seen since then other reports by Facts, for example, over 1 million barrel loss in demand so far, billion barrels a day. At least that's how they're calling it at the moment. Let's go to China and Albert Stromquist, principal at Landstrom Advisors. Albert, there's clearly a number of headlines that one could pick on, but I think I'd start with the more macro that we had China's premier yesterday, Premier Li Qiang, if I know if I pronounce his name right, but he's issued what would be his third warning about economic growth outlook in China, his third warning in a week. And not often the Chinese leadership is that transparent about weakness in the economic outlook. Your thoughts on where things are at the moment in China?
Well, it's the outlook, Sean, has certainly been softening from a more relatively bullish forecast of 6% growth, which was kind of the last guidance before yesterday from Li Qiang. The consensus of economists from the private sector pegs the annual growth forecast at about 5% per year, and there are outliers to that as well. Goldman Sachs, for example, is looking at 4.6%, and they're staying with that number for now. Look, that translates into a loss of energy demand that you have correctly put that at about 1 million barrels a day, seen a little stronger figures, but that's a significant drop, and that in turn has carried over into the refining sector, right? Where China has consistently been a strong exporter of transportation fuels to Asia, and is now restricting its export of transportation fuels to meet the remaining domestic demand for jet, automotive, and diesel. That is compounded by the plight of the independent refiners in Shandong, who have traditionally been dependent on Russian crude oil imports for at least 20% of their feedstock. They are now no longer able to procure those Russian deliveries. And as a result, the refining utilization in the private sector now is put at about something like 57%, right? Which means that margins are squeezed, and in the case of some of those refiners, even negative. So there is a sea change in the fuel demand side here in China, and the response of the government and industry to that.
The Vandana, one of the sort of in this wobble, in this sort of conflict as such, is the demand concerns, the demand destruction perhaps, but also the supply, obviously the supply disruption out of Russia, most notably, at the same time that we've had the largest release from the IEA, or at least the announcement of the largest release from the IEA. Where do you see those counter forces going? The presumption that Russian oil exports will be disrupted significantly in the second quarter, and at the same token, perhaps the IEA and its associated members coming in with a release from SPR to make up for that. Where do you see those balances over the 3 months?
Right, Sean. So that's exactly the ongoing challenge for the oil market. And we're probably going to continue seeing the sort of seesaw move. Brent seems to be anchored around $100 a barrel, but the market can't quite make up its mind whether it deserves to be above that, and above 101 as we speak now, and having finished at 98, as you mentioned, just 48, about 4-week low just last night. So I think there's recalibration happening on both sides. So as long as the Ukraine war continues, of course, the fear of Russian supply disruption, perhaps even becoming worse, as if the EU proceeds with a ban on Russian oil imports, if there's a retaliation by Putin, curbing gas supplies. So, that extreme, the worst case scenario risk will need to be factored in. So all of that will remain in the mix. I think what happened, I would say last week, I feel that the 180 million barrels collectively that are going to be released by the US, offering 120 the week before, and last week the other IEA members coming with 60 million barrels over a period of 6 months amounts to about 1.33 million barrels per day. I saw that, and reflecting what I thought the market perceived it as a tipping point, whereby we actually have, because, OPEC, non-OPEC had disappointed for several weeks before, but finally now we have more of a hose rather than a bucket trying to douse the flames in the oil prices. So the market took that as quite a bit of providing a bit of relief to whatever is going to be the Russian disruption. And mind you, nobody is really able to pin what is the amount of Russian oil lost. We've had range between 1.5 to 3 million barrels per day. I personally think 3 million barrels per day will be a bit too much. So there is recalibration going on, and that constant recalibration happening on the demand front as well. So you see Chinese demand outlook starting to sour, and then Shanghai starts to reopen, and you see that starting to perk up again. So that's essentially the seesaw I think we'll continue to see. But just to finish that comment off, I think by and large, we may have seen the worst of the oil price spike as a result of Ukraine. The only exception I see is if the EU comes up with something drastic and says that we are going to outright have a ban or very soon phase out Russian oil imports.
It does feel like we're moving steps closer to it becoming nearly unsustainable for Europe to not necessarily continue to buy Russian energy, but to continue to give billions of dollars every day to the Russian regime while it slaughters Ukrainians, not only in a traditional conflict, but in what is, at least in the reporting by most respected media outlets, actual war crimes. That seems like an unsustainable framework. More when than if.
Sorry, I would disagree to the extent that politically unsustainable, yes, in seeming to do something really drastic to stop Putin in his tracks, unsustainable. But really, when it comes to energy security, I think going any further in terms of banning or boycotting Russian supply is unsustainable. That's how I feel.
Well, maybe unsustainable over 10 years, but certainly over the coming time, I think politicians in Europe will struggle to sustain the posture of justifying this position. I mean, over the coming month or two, perhaps. Let's go back to China, because I think, as we talked about there, the unknown as to how much Russian oil gets disrupted, the counter unknown, Albert, is how much of demand destruction we have in China. Nomura Holdings, so it was a mention there of Goldman Sachs and others. Nomura, economist, as reported in Bloomberg, said that the risk of recession is rising in China, estimating that now, because a lot of the reporting has been focused on Shanghai, but there's actually over 370 million people in 45 cities now under full or partial lockdown in China, which accounts to close to 40% of China's GDP. This is a massive disruption if it's sustained. Looking beyond Shanghai, Albert, how big a challenge is this?
Well, that's the other side of the story that's not getting sufficient attention today. I'm glad you raised that, Sean. But the response of the government to Shanghai, to the cluster in Shanghai, has been brute force, and it has had a ripple effect around the country. While reporting is repressed, there is still information that leaks out by word of mouth to the rest of the population. And the reports are that the population of China, the people outside of these quarantine cities, are scared. They're scared by what they see in Shanghai. They're scared that they're going to become victims, as the Shanghai people have been, should infection clusters pop up in their own communities. And nowhere in China is safe today. Even here in Hainan Island, the city of Sanya has been shut for a week, the entire city. The city of Lingshui in central Hainan. So it's occurring around me as well, so I can feel the direct consequences of it, understand the sentiment of the population here in China. That has to, and should the virus continue to propagate, and it seems like for all practical purposes, it's become endemic now in the population in China. Should it continue to propagate and the government continue to assert the same level of forceful or brute response to it, yes, the impact on the economy is going to be far more severe than what's been predicted so far, with the attendant further deeper erosion of energy demand and economic output and trade and supply chains.
We did see overnight reporting, Albert, that in the context of Shanghai, that actually there was some level of social unrest, shops being broken into, food security issues emerging. And we had it's noted a few weeks ago in college campuses, some demonstrations against this approach. Is that a tangible sentiment, do you feel, the reporting out of Shanghai?
Apparently the delivery of aid to the population in Shanghai has been uneven. Why would you expect anything different in a city of 26 million people? And the result has been that some districts have experienced deep food shortages and hunger, attendant hunger. And I think what we saw on Sky News yesterday and other news services, and again today, was the just kind of the violent reaction of the people to being pushed to a red line where enough was enough, right? They needed food, they needed medication, they needed relief. So I think today the latest announcement here from Beijing is an attempt to back off of the citywide quarantine to allow districts with relatively few or no active cases of the virus to begin to open up to a more normal lifestyle, while the city focuses on those areas that are still hot. So that's a small baby step toward addressing the sentiment of the people. Remains to be seen now whether that direction will continue in terms of the government's policy toward treatment of the pandemic.
Let's welcome Mehmet Ogucu, Group CEO, Chairman of the London Energy Club. Mehmet, while we were waiting for you to join us, we were talking a little bit about this energy security issue Europe is facing versus the continued sort of purchasing of Russian crude and energy. And obviously there was reporting yesterday that the European Union is studying the possibility of an energy embargo. How do you read that now, politically versus economically, and the outlook for that possibility?
Well, the European Union is trying everything it can do, because right now it looks that the Russians will be starting a new attack from the eastern Ukraine to have total control of Donbass, and also the Odessa port, which is critical for everybody actually, including Ukraine, of course. No access to sea. Turkey will be facing Russia also, not only in Crimea, but also Odessa, and the border going all the way to Moldova. So therefore, EU wants to send some signal, strong signal to Putin. Austrian Prime Minister was in Moscow yesterday, and he came back empty-handed. So Putin is quite determined. So what else could be done in terms of pushing Russia to the corner so that this conflict could come to an early conclusion? And energy embargo is one of them which US tried. Whether it's going to work or not, and whether it's going to have a boomerang effect, rather than hitting Russia only, it will hit mostly also European Union countries, some of which heavily depend on Russia, up to 90% in some regards. So EU had already a soft policy of phasing out Russian gas by 2030, but how it's going to substitute? There is still a big question about it. And I don't think that there are any viable solutions to that right now. So everybody's worried about the next winter coming. Renewables will not be an answer. Yes, of course, it has to be stepped up, and there will be need for more renewables, probably more competitive in terms of price than fossil fuels, but it will take time. So short and medium term is the critical. I'm not sure how EU will be handling this, because for US it's easy. It's only 3%, 4% of the total gas oil demand. But whereas for Europe, it's going to be critical. And in terms of oil, whether release of strategic reserves, as US is doing now, 180 million barrels over the next 6 months, that's fine, they can do it. They have a huge stockpile. EU through IEA, because as you know, all IEA member countries have a requirement to keep about 90 days of their oil imports. So they have the strategic reserves. They will be releasing another 60 million as well. So in my view, I think EU will have some cracks along the way. Right now, there is a unity against Russia because of what it's doing illegally in Ukraine and humanitarian catastrophe. They have to do something. But over the long run, it will be difficult to sustain this. It will require a total re-engineering of European energy architecture That can be done, but over the years, as we know.
Not in the immediate term. We already see Hungary as an outlier now with the first crack in the European Union. And of course, if Marine Le Pen was to win the presidential elections in France, that would be a fairly sizable shift potentially in the European position. But just to address more immediate to you, Mehmet, in Turkey, we saw over the last few days reporting US Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland in Cyprus essentially telling the Cypriots to get on board with Turkey's vision for extracting gas out of the East Med. Tell us a little bit about that, how significant a geopolitical position that was and the change that it represents in the East Med.
Well, there is, of course, a revival of East Med pipeline, not through Greece and then under the Adriatic to Italy, but through Turkey, which seems to be more economically viable and politically sustainable. Therefore, US had withdrawn from the East Med pipeline, initial one, politically stopped supporting it. Now visiting Cyprus and Greece, and I'm sure she will come also to Turkey. And President Herzog of Israel was in Turkey. Bennett is coming, and the Turkish minister is going to Tel Aviv. So there is a movement on this field, but still the question remains, even if you have the political alignment between Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, and Israel, whether it's going to be commercially feasible to extract this gas, especially from Leviathan, whether it can be linked through Aphrodite of Cyprus and Zor and Nur of Egypt and come to Turkey. Because in Turkey right now, there is domestic demand going up. You know, it was about 48 BCM of gas consumed a year ago, and last year it was 60. So 12 BCM of demand increase. And this year it will be probably even higher.
Wow, that's
Turkey can buy Israeli gas for domestic needs. Plus, of course, it can put into TANAP pipeline and send further gas to Europe. Therefore, if there is an alignment in East Med, I think this could provide some relief to European Union, but it's not going to be immediate either.
Of course, these are mid to long term, but there's significant structural changes that perhaps inform a little bit about where, you know, the politics could go in the short term, because if these structural changes become bedded in, they will have to be factored into the political choices that are currently.
I believe that politically, EU and US will push very hard for that. This is what's needed. That was the main stumbling block. I think the same might apply to Kurdish region of Iraq, where there are very attractive gas fields. There is a danger of this also being controlled by Rosneft, because Rosneft heavily invested in the pipeline infrastructure there in oil fields, and they might also. So what will happen if Russia become a player in northern Iraq? Then the Iranian position, whether there is going to be sanctions to be lifted, and Iranian gas could start flowing through Turkey, where there is infrastructure already in place. So this might be a quicker solution.
Let's just go to the survey question before we run out. Sorry, because they are all such big topics of their own. I just want to come back to the China piece. Again, the point that we mentioned earlier about Nomura's outlook for China, which is quite bearish, maybe an outlier from the growing sort of consensus view. Obviously, the consensus view is building for a slowdown. But my question is, China will fall short of its official GDP target for 22 of around 5.5%. Agree or disagree? There is argument to be made that China will come out of this crisis, Vandana, with a bionic stimulus to sort of, as you mentioned in your earlier comments, 300,000 or 400,000 barrels a day in the first quarter is nothing really if one sees the second half of the year with a huge stimulus program in China.
Yeah, I think the danger of the oil market being so heavily focused on what's happening in Shanghai, what's happening with lockdowns elsewhere, is that it's going to miss the big picture. And, Albert just now alluded to that, and it's a very important point. How does Chinese economic recovery look like looking out into the rest of the year? So, personally, I don't have an inside line into the CPC's thinking, but personally, I really find it very hard for Beijing to be able to do a sharp U-turn anytime soon on the zero COVID policy, which means that, rolling lockdowns are going to be a permanent feature. Now, yes, China is expected to throw a lot of money. It's already started throwing a lot of money into infrastructure investment. But again, I think we have to bear in mind that this is not the old economy infrastructure investment that's happening. It's not going into building more roads and bridges or even railways, and certainly not the property market. It's going into digital infrastructure, right? So that's not going to create the kind of oil growth demand boom that we saw in China through from 1990 to 2010. So my personal view is I think Chinese oil demand growth, it will continue growing, of course. I don't expect it to go sharply negative, but it's going to moderate, perhaps 1.5%, 2% year on year. So, that is not in absolute terms, it's not really contributing the same as it was in the years gone by when China was growing at 5-6% with its oil demand.
Albert, just picking up on that, do you think there's anything that, we saw today supposedly in Shanghai, a shifting of the zero tolerance, given that they're allowing people out on the streets, at least in some instances, but there's still a very, within China context, a very high infection rate in Shanghai. Do you think there's any potential that this zero COVID could crack before the end of the year in the Communist Party meeting?
Could crack in what sense, Sean?
Well, in the sense that it could be abandoned, this policy to maintain zero COVID.
Well, no, I don't see the policy, this dynamic zero policy, facing that outcome this year. I think it's too important to the social stability that's required leading up to the party conference in October. And any U-turn that may be on the horizon through a large infusion of capital from the government, look, that would be predicated on achieving success in this dynamic zero with this dynamic zero policy. And given the kind of the rate of propagation of the virus now here in China, I think the view here from April is that the rest of the year is going to be fairly bearish for the government and for the economy.
Let's go to the survey result to give Mehmet the last word. So yeah, overwhelming agree. I suppose I should have been more precise in by how much. Maybe that's tomorrow's question. But Mehmet, coming back to just sort of closing thoughts on the Black Sea, if indeed this new Russian initiative is to take all of that, the eastern southern coast of Ukraine, there will be greater calls perhaps to close the Black Sea and to close the access from Turkey. Your thoughts on where the politics go if indeed, from a Turkey's point of view, if Russia was to take all of Ukraine's Black Sea coast?
That will be disastrous in many ways, because there will be huge pressure being applied by Russia on the Turkish Straits, which is the only international gateway to the markets, world markets. And Turkey, of course, will try to maintain its position vis-a-vis Ukraine, Russia, and West in a balanced way, because it's the only NATO nation now able to talk to both sides. Therefore, Turkey was the venue for peace talks or ceasefire talks going on. But if there is going to be such a heavy Russian dominance in Black Sea, this will change the whole geopolitics of energy and security in a significant way. Then Turkey has to make a decision to be perhaps more firm and resolute vis-a-vis Russia, together with EU and NATO. Also, Turkish interest in the Black Sea energy resources. As you know, Turkey has discovered one of the largest offshore gas reserves in the Black Sea, up to 510 BCM, and working to extract it. And then the Russian heavy influence in the region will also affect the investment decision there and safety security matters. So therefore, I think it will be a disaster if Russia dominates the Black Sea again, which was not foreseen in the past, because Black Sea was a faraway place for the EU and NATO. All of a sudden, now Black Sea is becoming the major point of contention between the two powers. And Turkey has to be careful also. Its dependence on natural gas, 45%, and about 25% of oil coming from Russia, nuclear power. It's going to be very difficult to juggle this with Russia becoming also aggressive vis-a-vis Turkey, because we have seen some naval mines planted in the mouth of Black Sea, entry to the Turkish Straits. So there will be lots of provocation. And then if NATO and Turkey are withdrawn to the conflict, the consequences will be severe for all sides.
Yeah. Maybe we're getting into the really dark part of this period of this war with all of this dynamic to play out. Let's hope not, but one has to anticipate that this gets worse before it gets better, and hence why some of our commentators are holding long positions on oil, and perhaps that 130 that we saw early in the war gets tested again. Albert, thank you as always. Really great to get insights from you wherever you are in the world, but obviously also when you are in China. Vandana, as always, thank you so much for joining us from Singapore. Mehmet, as always, thank you very much for being with us today. We'll catch up with everybody in the coming days. Thank you very much.
Good morning.
Thank you.